Hello everyone, today we talk about Turkish cavalrymen between the 11th and the 13th century, mostly the Crusader era, and exactly from this perspective, let's say, so not the broader Turkic world, but in its overextension at that point, to be covered in a generalizing video like this. Albeit, as we will see, there is surely a level of homogeneity in Turkic armies that can be easily observed from this typology of trooper that was fundamentally the overwhelmingly prevalent one, aside from any other kind of organizational consideration. There will be some change because today we don't talk specifically about even just the Turks from an ethnic point of view, as we will see. Also through the Crusader lens, the term Turk is employed to describe a broader ethnical variety of troops and in practice a specific type of warfare, right, a specific type of combat. And it is true that in general this typology of horsemen that was largely unarmored, right, and present sometimes in the tens of the thousands in the major Muslim armies of this time. We're talking chiefly about Syria, right? At this point, so the eastern neighbors of the Crusader states were fundamentally very similar in tactics to the cavalry of other nomadic peoples, right? And here we should make another distinction, that is properly what were these armies compared, for example, to the Central Asian ones, even remaining within the boundary of Turkic peoples that definitely were prevalent in the Eurasian steppes at this point and had almost Turk-sized others, right? And in this case, we're talking mostly about Seljuk armies that, as you know, were also heavily Persified, and they substantially had undergone a transformation that today we don't look at because we will save it for the army organization videos. There are important changes occurring also within the same what was namely here the Seljuk Empire that actually was disgregating before the same crusades happened, and that actually probably made them happen by a certain degree, and that therefore differed importantly depending on the various areas. Like the Sultanate of Rome will remain, for example, somewhat more exposed, at least in relative numerical terms, for example, to the permanence of certain more pastoral nomadic lifestyle, aside from the the gulams that will appear as more professional force, etc. This is a similar trend, right? But that happens in fact to other regional areas. But surely Persia was something else. Turkic mercenaries, or at least that enacted this kind of war of tactics, were fundamentally to be found very far and wide, right? Even in Europe. Right, if you think about the Kumans were used at some point as far as Germany as mercenaries, etc. So there is a broader picture, of course, that we tend to somewhat oversimplify about the steppes, but also tendencies, in fact, that bring to, for example, a process of sedentarization. That does change tactics. This is to be observed not just at this time in history, but I don't know if you think about the modifications that the Arsacid and Sasanian armies underwent historically towards a process of sedentarization, and the loss, in fact, of properly the nomadic lifestyle of the steppe that did have some influence. Again, we can't talk about that specifically, but it's important to understand how varied at some point the nature of also this lighter cavalry could be, right? Because one thing is literally the guy that has barely anything more than a knife and a quiver and bow, fundamentally. Another thing is, as we will see, a more heavily equipped, at least, a trooper like the ones of, could be described by the Itinerarium Regis Ricardi that we will read in a while. What is important in this regard, it seems to me it's fundamentally the case, is that the more the steppes influenced the local warfare, that is, say, the more injection of these troops can occurred in these armies, and the more there was a greater capacity properly of the individual trooper to fight with different weaponry. On the other hand, with the process of sedentarization, it was probably a greater tactical split, let's say, between properly the heavier troops and the lighter ones, and probably also other segmentation within the same, right? So that we can speak even of medium cavalry, not a light cavalry. And the boundary here is difficult to trace, right? It's seducing to stress, okay, yes, the homogeneity in a sense as we were doing before, but still we will see that the average Turkic cavalryman that could be facing Crusader army was not necessarily just the throwaway horse archer that would simply not even touch the enemy in melee combat, or was fundamentally designed just to hit and run away, right? It was mostly about that, but there was much more, and often we can't understand that from the sources that are vague. The Muslim historiography generally doesn't look much at these details. Western historiography is more critical, but when we can understand fairly well certain, let's say, aspects of Western armies, but when look at the Turks, there it's all more blended and less detailed, right? So as always, there is, in spite of the general acceptance of the fact that properly the powers of Syria were, for example, different from the Egyptian ones in terms of, like, the Egyptians would look much more Western in typology of fighting, at least. There were heavier troops, more infantry, etc. So the more we look from Syria eastwards, Mesopotamia, Persia, etc., we start seeing the stereotype is mostly the swarms of horse archers and nothing else. Probably it was much more we know that it was much more segmentation, and also a relatively different typology of combats. For example, javelins, as we will see, are sometimes overlooked. And we have to consider the javelin normally was used also with more effectiveness against armored opponents than the same arrows would. As we will see, they were shot literally in the millions in a single battle by, easily by an army of a range of tens of thousands, considering how many arrows normally these guys brought themselves with them. But not to an overwhelming effect. As we know also, just the missile element is not enough, right, in combined tactics to get it done with. And also we're talking about low Middle Ages, right? We're talking about a moment in history where, yes, armies could differ in fighting style, whatever, but they were substantially similar, right? Much more symmetric than in later times, about which people generally care less, proportionally, at least as far as it seems to me. So, as we were saying before, contemporary Christian chroniclers generally use the term Turk to describe indistinctly Seljuks, Turkomans, Syrians, or armies comprising mainly these troops, and maybe had some Western troops themselves, but we've made videos about that. If you look, especially the Sultanate of Rome made important use of Western mercenaries. I don't know, Frankish knights, Italian crossbowmen, Greek skirmishers, Georgians, etc. And as we know, also the later Mamluk armies were fundamentally also drawn from areas like Russia, etc. They were surely closer in that the traditional Turkic fighting style, right? But as we were saying before, but did not distinguish much also properly the ethnicity. This is the point I wanted to make. For example, Saladin's armies, right? They're mostly described as Turkish in the sources, right? But they actually and also contained many Bedouins, Arabs, Kurds, Sub-Saharan Africans, and even others, right? This aspect is also overlooked. The same Syrians actually made an important use of Arab troops. Because it was just next door, right? And certain dynamics quite never end. Arabia had, after Islam, hadn't changed an enormous deal, right? It was still fundamentally semi-nomadic realities, always lurking at these, other advanced civilizations in the sedentary areas and richer areas, and wanting to join them for loot, for money, etc. And so it was somewhat easy, to as many could get in, right? This is also another aspect that has the roots not much in the matter of military organization per se, but also properly in the political and social nature of Islamic power in these areas. And from some sources, many, we have illuminations, but mostly Persian ceramic that is quite prolific in terms of iconography about these type of troopers, that we can observe this wide area, fundamentally stretching from the Jazira, right, the region of northern Syria around Mosul, Raqqa, and the Yakbekra, right, even up to Azerbaijan, etc. And we can extend this far and wide, geographically speaking, because as we were saying before, still these troops mostly came from much far away lands, mostly of Central Asia, right? And the connection always existed in a way, as we will see even, for example, in armament, in equipment, how the local powers supplied some of them, and the sharing of technologies, etc. So if we had to describe the look of a typical Turkic cavalryman at this point, well, we would, here we can also use Seljuk in general as an idea, but maybe I say better on Turkic because, as we've just said, the picture is more varied, right? And starting from properly the clothing, also because visually, right, that's what we get iconographed, because they weren't particularly armored, right? The Turks had introduced historically from Central Asia into the Caliphate a higher amount of lamellar armor, right, to chainmail, which is debatable, considering that also Mesopotamia, Syria, Egypt, etc., still, had such, elements, and the Caliphate surely had an important level of, properly of military technology and capability, and properly exposure, since the Islamic conquest, to an enormous variety of military cultures. There is this idea that, in fact, properly there was also metallurgical tradition from Central Asia, as we will see in a while, that had somewhat changed gradually properly the face of armor. But as we were saying also before, locally, before the majority of these cavalrymen would be unarmored, right? Maybe, as we will see, something rather in head protection, as it's normal, but a very few armor for this average trooper was involved. There is also another aspect, that these steppe culture normally tend to expose a lot exteriorly their wealth, right? So you're talking about jewelry, you're talking about, these guys often, Seljuks, wore earrings, or properly here, as we'll see, fine clothing, right? That was a propagandistic measure, from the steppes to reduce this quickly aggregative capacity that normally revolves around the richer guy, that is meant in that reality to be such because he's a good warrior, right? Because otherwise there wouldn't be much other way outside of loot to own such treasure. So that was an idea: follow me because I am the good one. I know how to reward you, right? So this maybe remained a bit just like in fashion and style, and there would be also local influences, as we will see just in a while, to this Turkic clothing. But let's say the most typical one, in essential, is the longish top coat with right over left flap in the front and in the chest, known as the mukallab. We described it recently in the video we made about Mamluks, about Mamluk cavalrymen. Flap at the front, right, and plus embroidered hems, cuffs, and collars, and around the upper arms the usual tirades bands that were apparently actually a Byzantine loan, right? It was present famously enough in the Islamic medieval period as these embroideries, usually in the form in fact of armbands sewn onto robes of horn. And it was a sort of badge, right? They were bestowed upon high-ranking officials mostly, right? To show the loyalty to the caliphate. Could be probably a gift to distinguish individuals, really like badges. They had usually inscribed with the ruler's name, and they were embroidered properly with threads of precious metal and decorated with complex patterns. They were a symbol of power. But as far as we see, aside from the production and export that were strictly regulated and overseen by a government-appointed official, let's say probably in these earlier days, they were much more widespread, almost as the average look of these guys. And they were likely influenced by the tableon. It was a decorated patch added to the body of the mantle as a badge of rank or position. Since late Roman times in the Byzantine dress. This is just a curiosity to notice, but just to stress how different military cultures coexisted, to the point that when you talk about a Turkic cavalryman, there could be also probably this type of badge. For cavalry, Turks normally wore tall, loose boots, right? Baggy trousers. There could be forms of head protection, such as a small cap with a turban wrapped around it. There could be also a similar type of turban, but without the embroidered trailing headband, and turban propers as well. Right, worn at least as early as late 11th century. Another form of headgear and protection was a fur-trimmed hat, which is fundamentally almost identical to the mitre caps of 18th century grenadiers, right? And it was decorated with fur, etc. But the structure, properly with this triangular frame of in the front, right over the forehead, probably was reinforced with a metal plate, at least sometimes, so as an extra protection that fundamentally was to protect just the frontal part of the head without the rest, let's say. And this is an interesting characteristic that, as far as I know, is not particularly frequent in the steppes, as it could be like in a Middle or Near Eastern context, right? It probably speaks for a higher degree of wealth, wealth availability, right, in the sedentary areas, and probably also some costumes were, as we were saying before, heading towards a sedentarization of these cavalry and some form of greater hand-to-hand combat capability, right? Because in the steppes normally the light horse archer just doesn't need weight at all, right? Everything stays in its speed. So much, in fact, that as we were saying before, in the case of the Sultanate of Rome, we can see more evidently how, for example, the traditional shepherds that fought this hit and run tactics also used more mounts than the gulams, the more professional ones. Instead, relied on more kind of slower tactics fundamentally, and with a greater cadence, for example, of the shot, etc. Because they were heavier fundamentally, so it could be better armored and to be more exposed without having to run away and to perform like this kind of more compact, formation tactics than the traditional steppes horsemen. They wouldn't literally even care to come to hand combat in general, right? And in fact, the Gulams also had less horses in that regard, which doesn't mean that they were, not full equestrians. Basically, this horsemanship was maintained at dramatically high levels, but still, properly indeed, so technical capacities, etc. This was not as it had been back in the day, properly in the heart of the steppe, right? It was something else and connected to fundamentally a heavier level of cavalry. So this kind of mitre cap was, with the triangular type, was called with the name of Schwerpunkt, right? It was a Turkic origin in itself, and it was also associated mostly to some kind of higher status, not always, but probably is also a consequence of centralization. It was worn only by emirs and chieftains as an indication of rank, right? In fact, even Saladin was recorded to have worn one, but concealing a male cap beneath. So it was fundamentally an ethnic symbol rather than else. And like in symbology here and ideology are very important also for morale, right? We know that the Schwerpunkt was worn under both the Ayyubid and Bahriya dynasties, right? And it would be eventually abolished by the Circassian Mamluks later on. And this type of hat appears in illustrations only from the late 12th century, but probably was commonly in use somewhat earlier. And the principal illustrations of this type of hat come from the Sultanate of Rum, the Jazeera, Iraq, and Azerbaijan as an area. So the Seljuk and Syrian Turks, but not only them, usually wore their hair very long, in three tails, one at each side of the head and one at the back. And mustaches were also usually long. The same Alp-Arslan that Victor Massacred, could allegedly, among all the various traditions about him, tie the ends of his own mustache behind his head. While beards could be full, short, or very wispy, sometimes comprising no more than a, quote, shadow on either side of the jaw, and a small tuft under the bottom lip. Speaking of armament, and as we were already hinting at before, the Itinerarium Regis Ricardi describes for us specifically Saladin's largely Syrian army at the Battle of Suf in 1191. We made a pretty long video about the battle in tactical detail. And he writes, quote, "The Turks are almost weaponless, carrying only a bow, a mace furnished with sharp teeth, a sword, a lance of reed with an iron tip, and a lightly hung knife." So, you see, even in the steppe, you see this armament composition normally. And you understand that, in spite the author says, they're almost weaponless, right? And he's probably referring to the standards of Western heavy cavalry at that point. They say, carry only a bow. Yeah, okay, but then a mace furnished with sharp teeth, a sword, a lance of reed with an iron tip, and a lightly hung knife, right? So this is hardly like an, weaponless, right, opponent. Right? And albeit we don't have here properly the exact typology was referring to, we know archaeologically, iconographically, and from other sources still that, yeah, these weapons were effective also against, against an important range of opponents, mostly the same ones the same Turks had to face in this in this regard. They were mostly themselves, right? The mace, for example, is traditional of the steppes. It's also, overall in many cultures, but stemming from that context, but the idea of the armor breaker, right, or at least of the weapon that is capable to cause trauma underneath the armor, right, and that in the steppes is also associated to the idea that if you have, if you can't get close to the enemy, right, so much to hit him with a mace, well, it's because either you're very well armored for doing so, or because you're extremely, almost, heroic, right, to do that. And there are probably certain practices in Turkic warfare that entailed almost, like a physical wrestling on horseback against the opponent, or doing things like pulling the horse's tail that were knotted for preventing it at the same time. So a kind of bravadery that surely is not exemplificative of the standard combat that these guys would attempt, but still should make us understand how it was still likely to get into hand-to-hand combat in certain situations. As swords as well, right? There would be, as we will see, of different types actually, and with some effectiveness capability, and it's not just a few to have a sword just by itself, right? Sabers, for example, could be produced more cheaply. It's part of the reason why they probably start spreading, especially throughout all the 13th century. That in the steppes cultures, maybe because of the Mongol Empire and some needs of standardization for the mobilization of large masses of troops, but that traditionally also probably the steppe sword had been actually straight. The same types that eventually, from which the European swords historically had also stemmed from, right? The long swords, sometimes even around the tip, but what important balance shifted towards, in fact, the same tip to slash, right, to cut from horseback down. Which require actually higher training than saber normally. And there are, however, certain imposing curved swords that had nothing to, like, what's better, like a curved straight sword. It's like asking whether a black or white cat is better to catch a mice, right? It's not really that important actually, and opologically speaking, it's not even a correct question posed in this way. Then there is a langsam reed with an iron tip, so also further offensive capability on horseback, and a lightly hung knife. And in spite of this set of weapons that we get from this type of cavalry, is that it's fundamentally still light, right? Which by standard, it's not a matter of how armored they are, but how much they can hold the ground. It could even say not necessarily heavy, but they surely close in against other opponents armed and like themselves. Against Western heavy cavalry, but it was, as we know, Crusades, that wasn't quite the same thing. But also, yes, there were important bodies of Turkic cavalry capable of properly getting, and willingly, of course, to get in the melee against the Westerners, which usually didn't turn out fine. Like, tip of the balance is the more heavily armored and more collectively trained Western feudal cavalry, but still, right, always consider that today we don't talk about it, but the Turks themselves had pretty heavy cavalry, right? Their elite was, basically the same. Turned communities politically and socially had less of it, quantitatively speaking, compared to the Westerners. And as we were saying before, also we're talking specifically about this Eastern foes. When we're all talking about Egypt, we find something already heavier, quantitatively speaking. So this naturally informed the same tactics, and against, in this case, against the Crusaders, we're less documented for the aforementioned reasons, so for Turks versus Turks battles, but we have an idea of something that is distinctly superior to the standard light throwaway horse archer that has really no much of a further combat capability, right? That still existed in some important numbers here and there, but they were mostly runners, or people that in fact relied mostly on hit and run tactics to pursue the enemy, to loot, etc., as there were plenty of around. But still, it is important to stress that in the steppes, normally, everybody had this kind of equipment, at least maybe less of metal weapon around, maybe. But the idea of knowing how to use a spear, of course, to have javelins next to the bow and arrow, was something that was normally more condensated in the individual in the steppes. That was probably gradually lost, and here what we're observing is a sort of hybrid between that kind of trooper, but in a more relaxed way, relatively properly to the individual training, and or some kind of greater abundance from a sanitary context. We're still a question. Military skills were mastered, right, for military standards. Again, we can't say how much this picture gets close to the lighter or heavier type, right? We just observed that this would have been standard for a Western source such as the Itinerarium, right? Some Turks are said to have carried in addition a small axe suspended from the saddle, which is yet another anti-armor weapon. Also, speaking of the bow, that was the principal offender in at least the interest of properly of damage ratio in a battle altogether, considering the mass of the troops, right? Because these guys could naturally chase and kill with a sword that was naturally much deadlier than a single arrow on average by employment, right, individually. But still, what made the difference on the battlefield was this enormous amount of arrows constantly shot against the enemy that, as we will see, didn't actually inflict a dramatic physical damage to enemy armies, but would fundamentally exhaust them from a psychological point of view. And part of the reason why such horsemen wouldn't be so eager to join in hand-to-hand fighting is political in nature, because many of them would join from spontaneously, right, without tributing actually much respect towards the authority that was organizing the army. They were just in for the loot, and they would fundamentally not be controlled, but they were important because they laid waste the enemy country. They somewhat protected as a screen strategically the larger armies, right? So in the process we're saying before, from this kind of tribal to professional element, the change would gradually occur. But still, as we know, these Islamic powers would always inject every once in a while these kind of more tribal element, right, in the armies to fundamentally eventually settle it down, and would gentrify it, and then become kind of dangerous, because that's also for what many of them were in, like not just for the loot, but at that point say, okay, if this guy is successful, he will give us land, otherwise we'll desert him, right? So at that point you needed other hungry guys coming from the steppe to keep at bay these other now sedentarized elements that were politically heavy in the local situation. So it was always more or less this game, and the situation was, as you know, also fairly unstable, right? The Seljuk Empire at this point was just basically a quasi-feudal reality with practically no concrete political cohesion aside from these local potentates, kind of a provincial base. And still, however, sharing ideally the idea of sovereignty for essentially need of political legitimization, etc. And that's also why these troops were so present there in a way, because the situation was so unstable. This couldn't be like an army like the old days of the Caliphate. It was fundamentally a professional permanent army. Right here, that element was reduced to that kind of quasi-feudal element, like a bit in the West, right? Albeit with actually less stability compared to the latter, for that matter. And also probably the exposure of the region to the continuous raids and pressure of the nomadic peoples that in the West wasn't quite there, at least, just up to Central Europe by a certain degree. So speaking of the bow, we have this important weapon that the Turkish composite bow probably relied for its effect on more powerful and regular tension rather than the weight of its arrows, that in fact seemed to have been light. Right, this limited the penetration somewhat, so that although they could pierce armor, they often did not. This is generally normal for most missiles, but these lighter types, increasingly so. And when they did, also they may inflict only a shallow wound or no wound at all. There are these kind of images of Caucasian knights that would be, hit by lots of arrows, but fundamentally these not being able to penetrate enough armor and the padded garment underneath, and therefore like going around with a lot of arrows stuck to it. Of course, that was risky as well, because also even smaller wounds can kind of deplete you enough, right? Even if they don't hit a major vessel, if you start being hurt by many of them, it can really become a problem at the moment, and especially more as we know without antibiotics. These guys would die of infection largely as after the battles. And naturally, this type of arrow was mostly designed for Turkic warfare altogether. So, as most military cultures, like, there is not a sudden adaptation to a new circumstance. Also because the whole system still kind of worked, as we've seen. It was relatively symmetric in offensive effect on different more heavily armored enemies that, however, were also kind of smaller in number, as mostly the Westerners were. But even here, usually sources maybe exaggerate the numerical differences, but yeah, normally Muslim armies were usually larger in number, right? But also, as we've seen, there were so this was compensated by this kind of lighter trooper here that, of course, was less effective. So the two systems kind of counterbalance each other. Like in practice, actually, Western cavalry scored an impressive amount of results against Turkic tactics, right? They had the upper hand most of the times, right? It's not even a matter of it's a matter of the system altogether functioning. This one, Crusader states were largely depleted in forces numerically. Nobody was much interested to go fight and die in the Near East. Fundamentally, the main problem was manpower and political cohesion. But on the field, objectively, the myth that the Western tactics were powerless against the harassing arrow hails of stepped horse is a myth, right? Even in terms of speed of maneuverability, Western heavy cavalry could perform an astonishing amount of actions that mostly ended up in the fact that mostly the Muslims didn't have enough counter attacking capabilities after, aside from horse archery, right? Their elite was normally too contained. There is reason also too precious to be risked from a political, social point of view. So this is completely another topic from today's video, but it's also important to stress, especially when we realize fundamentally how much arrows were actually shot in combat, right? For example, the bow case of these horsemen could double as a quiver, right? Was usually hung on the left. There are, with the quiver suspended from the belt at the right. There are occasionally depictions of the other way around. But the important thing here is that quivers could contain up to 60 arrows, right? And in addition, spare bows and extra quivers were often carried, sometimes as many as 3 of each. So it was quite easy to see way more than 100 arrows to be carried per horseman, right? So this means, as you understand, if you larger armies at this time on the field to be properly employed tactically in a unitary fashion with no more than 30,000 men, of which, if we count 20,000 these horse archers, which usually could be even more, you have easily 2 million arrows. Yes, and they were actually, just to think about, as we were saying, for this gives you an idea of also what the broader logistical weight that is often overlooked of the whole system was, right? 2 million arrows sounds crazy, and they were actually shot, right? Because they wouldn't, waste them, given they had gone there exactly to shoot them all, right, and made all the fatigue together. So consider also the other military systems, right, that were coping with this were mostly equivalent at the same time. Think about the weight of logistical needs, right? Consider that, as we were saying before, those nomadic armies that had also brought spare horses, etc., herds with them, they had dramatic logistical difficulties in, for example, in summer or during the arid season. They could fundamentally launch offensives only through certain specific along certain specific valleys, certain areas, because otherwise they wouldn't have properly the capacity to support all of this. So think about even arrow production in this. Like, it was enormous, right? And think also in the economy here. I've never read anything about that, but the amount was really this one. And as we were saying before, it wasn't much about the physical damage, but this constant harassment, right? If you make the maths, right, let's assume 2 million arrows, right, and if you shoot them all in one day, you have something like 333 arrows in an hour, right? And this is during the whole day, which usually, the fight was not. It is true, though, that yes, they normally battles against the Turks, as we've seen, were these dominated by this uncertainty, because these swarms of horse archers fundamentally, and all the dust, thinking about in here in the semi-arid areas, etc., properly obscured what the hell was going on, right? Sometimes the enemy didn't even know whether there was a concrete army, the heavier element around there. This is quite clear at Massacred, for example, that they would go on for days harassing the enemy camps, doing something that was aimed properly at straining the nerves of the opponent and confuse and puzzle him, right? But imagine, those battles that we have seen here and there, where properly the armies met on a single day, right? And even if these arrows were shot, all like perfectly distributed during the day, it would be 83,000 per hour, which means 23 per second, at every second, right? So think about what this means concretely, especially for the guys of the first ranks, right? It's a very intense pressure, and it's designed literally, you freak out, you start properly, you can't take it anymore, together with the adrenaline, the physical exhaustion, the thirst, the sun. You have to wear armor, by the way, all the time, because as we've seen, that's kind of the only effective thing. It doesn't protect you 100%, but let's say still it's mostly effective. Think about cooking literally in the Syrian desert in summer during the campaigning season, like that, under constant arrow. You can't take it anymore. Like, it's, with smoke sent at you, especially to make you. Also, the Turks often suffered. We've seen it. The Battle of Hattin, which we documented, was this constant harassment, right? And considering that at night they didn't shoot, so you can easily see here that it could be even 100,000 arrows per hour, possibly even more, right? So this is insane, right? And this is just what the single guy could bring. Then there would be special arrangements, like in that case, Saladin had made an enormous effort to supply his army of of a continuous amount of arrows coming from other cities, from faraway places, to have them, to unload them on the enemy continuously. It's obsessive. Many people would break, right? You easily break, even if if you take a normal person today, you put them, even refreshed and kind of fairly safe under this thing. From a psychological point of view, you say stop at a freaking time, right? And there were all other this psychological element, even the importance of military music, of shouts, of also how certain maneuvers were performed. The Turks were masters in this kind of tactics, right? So that made a freaking lot, right? Always remember, war is a clash between moral forces, right? The physical element is secondary. Even properly in the power of weapons or the physicality of individuals, even less. It's first and foremost about the mind. And there are interesting hints that show that the newer all-curve form of the Seljuk bow also gradually replaced the previous one, that was more angled in form of the same composite bow, in most Islamic regions during the 12th century. This might have been some see properly also from other technological hints, maybe an adaptation to Crusader tactics, the fact that since Beryllium, the Turks spotted that all this arrow fire was not enough, right, to cause sensible, concrete damage to enemy armies all together, because they were enough protected and resilient in that sense. So they could even pin them down as it happened, but fundamentally not making a breakthrough because they were too hard properly in ranks compared to what they were normally used to soften them up satisfactorily in order for the charge of the heavier reserves, right? And the light lengths could be used for thrusting or throwing as well, right? The javelins might also be carried. This is another custom in the steppes. Many steppes peoples, especially also the ones of the Western Eurasia, have made important use of javelins altogether. But this is kind of a universal weapon, and of course lances can be used for thrusting as well, for throwing, as we explained elsewhere. And the javelin has a greater penetrative capacity, right? Remember that normally, even if you read Western chronicles, etc., most of the deadly wounds caused to armored opponents, especially in sieges that imply normally a shorter range of action, of missile, etc., are from javelins. So this doesn't have to be underestimated, nor in these armies, nor also in the Western ones. By a certain degree. Turks also used small shields held by a single central grip that are useful just to parry mostly blows into hand-to-hand combat, right? As we've seen, that the broader protection for the men was low, right? They were usually unarmed. So this was mostly conceived in the case of hand-to-hand combat. It could still happen, right? And to be quick, this was not a large shield, right? Like mostly the ones used by heavier cavalry. And this was mostly just to maximize protection and weight, right? And speed capability, because it added all together. Think about having even more than 100 arrows with you. They weigh a lot, right? So for lighter cavalry, it may be a problem, right? It weighs. There are interesting designs, actually, in these types of shields. Normally they were held by a single central grip, right? And they were quite general in use. And there are designs such as, for example, the rose type, like all the circular forms, but with some kind of relief at the edges. Could be useful also properly for fencing reasons, so pairing blows to kind of sticking the blade, not making it run over the edge, right? And in part, they may have reflected also some kind of heraldic device, but still there's kind of functionality to that, right? Also because, you know, if the blade simply passes around, you know, over the shield edge, you can't fall somewhere else, landing on your flesh, right? And as we've seen, given that there wasn't this dramatic amount of armor or padding, right? Always consider, especially about the missile element, that horses largely were unarmored, right? The heavier cavalry normally had padded horse armor. Sometimes we don't see even that. This is all a problem that we'll address in another video, but the greater losses in these battles were mostly from the horses, right? The missile fire, both in these contexts, but also in the West, etc., was properly claiming victims, mostly among horses, were largely unarmored, right? And overwhelmingly unarmored. Even in the case properly of the elite, especially in these centuries here, like it's mostly from the late 13th century, see examples of properly of mail or for horses specifically. Some could have some plate elements properly. We underestimated that this is present in certain contexts also where archery was important. I don't know, the Danubian frontier between the Byzantines and the Hungarians in the 12th century. You see, especially the frontal protection is important in this regard for heavier cavalry, but most cavalry wouldn't really have this kind of protection, and they would die easily. Sense. Consider also that the increasing level of professionalism in Seljuk armies brought their archery techniques to become somewhat different and more varied, right? The steppes surely knew how to enact this mass volley, or better continuous actually shooting, as we've seen. It was mostly the repetition that made an impact. Because, okay, there are some considerations, but what I'm saying here explains a bit that, you know, such troops were trained now to properly shoot in some zones, right? For example, dropping arrows within a designated area such as the interior of a castle, right? The rate of shooting was also noted by all observers. It's important in open field, mostly what's the rate, like properly how volleys are delivered, right? It's very important to stress this, as I imagine that in the steppes, volleys can easily be mistaken. We would get more, you know, in the hands mostly of smaller groups, right? So they would act more independently from one another. Said Seljuk archery from 11th, 12th centuries, introducing some kind of greater, you know, collective training would at least medium-sized contingents would increase somewhat also the precision of properly of how to deliver the mass fire in certain areas of the battlefield. In the same period, there was the widespread use of the Navak or Myra arrow guide, which shot high-velocity short arrows, right? These are possibly the darts recorded at the Battle of Dorylium in the Gesta Francorum, for example. There would be a lot to say about this. We will surely deepen this topic in other videos, but let's say that this adds to the variation, right, and to the idea that more trained troops, of course, were being sold, right, in this war, right? It wasn't just about the original tribal background. It was about increasing properly the quality of the single contingents, and this naturally went in parallel with properly different tactical roles and the increase in quality and the decrease in number of the same specialized troops, right? At least in the gulams, this is quite evident. Eventually, you know, there are other kind of reforms, at least different organizational forms that we will see for the armies of the Zengids, of the Ayyubids, etc. in the tactics and military organization videos. Speaking of swords that we were hinting at before, there could be of various types. It could be normally long or short curved types, and also straight types. And Indian swords enjoyed a very high reputation throughout all the Islamic world at this time. What mostly we call as Damascus blades and all the, you know, the thermochemical, process that brings to, the characteristics. And also we know actually scarcely. This is a bit of a mystery, right? But we kind of have an idea how they could make certain qualities to be so good, but not properly reconstruct the actual methods. And this is important because Damascus, Syria altogether, doesn't actually seem to have produced dramatically high quality blades, right? Since the 7th century, Indian steel was highly regarded for its quality, and there's a bit of debate about whether Indian swords were particularly good or Egyptian Syrian swords were particularly bad, right? This is not altogether clear, but let's allow ourselves to make some consideration. Certainly, an author like Al-Tartusi, for example, recognized that Egyptian blades were inferior not only to the Indian swords, but also, for example, to the Andalusian, the North African, and the Chinese ones too. Now, this is very interesting, and there are surely considerations here that are somewhat more difficult in nature to make, especially pointing out, I don't know, North Africa, like an area that wasn't, aside from Tunisia, particularly developed in, or maybe the westernmost area, Morocco, yes, but there were surely important local traditions. Spain, China, India surely were areas that, regionally speaking, could afford to produce historically. Spain always had important metallurgic tradition since the ancient world. India, China were, some true massive, lots of extensive civilizations, and it's normal that exports would privilege the good quality sword. So this can be a reason. The other reason is traditionally that the wood steel, right, produced in India and exported ever since up to very long time, right, was possibly the best quality out there, at least in the mass production of it. This has been explained because of Indian ovens could be insufflated more continuously and regularly, and that's very important to maintain a certain temperature because of the monthly winds that help in this regard. So they could properly achieve some feats in the blade making that other peoples wouldn't. It's not that Syria or Egypt had scarce swords, or in general they couldn't fundamentally produce as good ones. It's just that quantitatively, properly, they didn't have the same amount of production. This may be it's not even about lack of resources strictly meant. It may be properly a different reliance on other methods. It's not about the steel that is being improved throughout medieval civilization. Fundamentally in the West, it's by the 15th century that the hydraulic capabilities will allow, ovens to be properly more performing, etc. The metallurgical improvements would come accordingly, but simply it might have been due to the market, right, to the general investment in other. As we see, Egypt was basically the greatest power around in this context, in the Near Eastern and surrounding fundamentally. So it happens often historically that the largest militaries are actually not the most performing from a technological point of view, right? If you pick today the United States Army, and armed forces in general, they are fundamentally less technological on average of amount of troops deployed compared to, I don't know, the Belgian or the Australian forces. Why? Because they have a much larger military that is superior, because not just of the amount properly of military force, but also the combination of force that makes the cost of uniform high technology equipment scattered everywhere nonsensical, right? It might have been the same because of the Egypto-Syrian axis, let's say, at this time, and the fact that we have in fact sources from there say that, you know, Indian swords were imported apparently also in great number, and properly the blades, not even the swords, right? The blades were rehilted, or the same swords were rehilted and decorated according to local taste or prevailing fashion, actually tells us that these guys had actually money to spend and that they could afford these weapons and this import because they had properly the money for it. Another important metallurgical tradition, famously enough, that, you know, some of these fine swords came from Central Asia itself, right? From the same Turkic, you know, military background. The problem even in there is always the same story. How, you know, quantitatively speaking, in order to provide to larger armies, you know, what are the dynamics that brings to this? Is that Syrian or Egyptian smiths were less capable of, you know, producing high quality blades? It doesn't sound very, you know, very plausible, right? Everybody more or less could achieve that level, but there would be other factors that would be kind of less, you know, make it less convenient, right? It depended on too many political and social factors that we cannot count for the low Middle Ages. The same also goes, as we were saying before, these were exports, right? So for very good blades, normally like other 9 sacked, right? But they still were used because also troopers were, you know, also often equipping themselves privately, and they customizing their equipment, etc. And they might have afforded just certain levels of equipment. Now, as we were saying before, is, you know, it's also war is very economical in nature. The same von Clausewitz says that, you know, consider that in war what functions most of the times is the good enough. It's not the best, qualitatively speaking, because that would be decontextualizing its use from the actual reality of war. That is not just military, but also political and social, right? So this is important to stress in general. I also look favorably about Egypt in general. Syria was a more contained power, right? It was mostly harassing the northeastern part of the Crusader states. It had a good military average, right? But as we were saying before, that doesn't mean they have to be the most technologically advanced, right? That's actually often mismatchingly the case. Also, captured Frankish swords feature in among Turkic armies, and they underwent similar adaptation with the rehilting, decoration, addition, and so on. Other equipment imported from India included lances, corselets. Some suggest they were mostly in scale or lamellar fashion. We don't know. I honestly don't know. Surely there was an intense market of arms and armor scattered throughout all the Middle East, Central Asia, etc. So, sub-Indian continent produced, you know, also what proper. Speaking of Turkic clothes, aside from the coat, etc., but they were often of brocade or silk, were very bright, right? The silk itself was somewhat resistant, at least if, you know, I don't know about the specific clothes in structure, etc., but they can be resistant to, at least to consumption, so that may be properly also a reason why they were used. As we were saying before, the Turks normally like it also to boast their wealth, and most of these people probably lived on horseback still, right? A good half of them were coming from a semi-nomadic background still, so they wouldn't have much other way to probably depot their goods, or to, you know, they would bring them with them in a way. I mean, not literally that they didn't have a house or a magazine or whatever, but it was still important politically for them and socially to show, right, when they went for war, that their best garment. Normally we see as we've seen in the Iranian ceramics, etc., geometric patterns or floral or arabesque motifs on a bright base color to be particularly common. And yeah, and this is the picture more or less we can give. Could we be more specific? I don't think so. Also because as we were seeing at the beginning, there were lots of other peoples that were called Turks and that even maybe fought like them. There was surely a process of Turkicization of military culture, right, between the golden age of the Caliphate and the rise of the Mongols, right, that had brought the prevalent military culture out there. So it wouldn't be strange to see actually a very interesting melange of military traditions, of customs, etc. But when we look at the military essence of what made the difference on the field, we're essentially looking at this light cavalry with some probably with minor but probably increasing hand-to-hand capacity throughout this period, which still would make them kind of uneasy at closing in against well armored and rested opponent, right? And that would, however, also perfectly conceive how to do it, right? And that also and we have to consider this fighting regularly also against each other, and therefore being more apt for that kind of warfare that was essentially adapted to fight also enemies like the Crusaders. Always remember that for the Muslims, the huge trauma of the medieval era is the Mongol invasion. It's Baghdad razed to the ground. It's as if in the West somebody came and razed Rome to the ground. Right, it would have been the greatest tragedy in the history of mankind. Well, for them, it was basically the equivalent of it. But as far as the Crusaders were involved, they of course knew what the risk was, right, and they fought bitterly against them. But they weren't so traumatized by it. They kind of understood, well, that's just yet another people that comes, next. Right, given what they were habituated to in the Near and the Middle East, just historically with this alternation of dynasties, of corps, of new rulers, of invaders, etc. It wasn't, after all, even the worst thing that could happen to them, right? And yet there was probably even in there some adaptation to Western custom, right? And altogether, even in later centuries, intense trade traffics, etc., especially with the Syro-Lebanese, Palestinian, Egyptian coast, that would be fundamentally controlled by Egypt after Crusader times, brought to an important connection via Mediterranean to the West itself, right? We've seen it also talking about Mamluk armies, etc., and we will keep talking about them. I mean, we just began, right? We just began to scratch the surface, and there is still really a lot to tell about these armies, these military cultures, etc. I'm sorry if I'm vague in general when trying to make, but believe me, it's embarrassing to present a video like this where you have to stereotype such a huge variety of troopers, right? And I always try to stick to a fair kind of balanced judgment about what we get about the military essence, mostly aside from the cultural kind of fashion, ethnic characteristics, on the base of what we see, also what I generally, measured through even properly studying the strictly military kind of tactical, especially, but also strategical point of view, and this is pretty much it. So for today we stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time.